Persistent aggression in the West Philippine Sea. Recently, a China Coast Guard vessel blasted water cannons and sideswiped a Philippine research vessel in waters off Pag-asa Island. This is the first reported attack of its kind against a fisheries ship in the area. This also marks the first use of water cannons by China against a Philippine ship operating near Sandy Cay 2.
The BFAR, Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, has condemned the CCG's quote-unquote aggressive interference on their vessels. The ships were on a routine marine scientific research mission near Pag-asa Cay 2 in the West Philippine Sea. Beijing's boat fired water cannons and sideswipes the BRP Datu Sanday twice, damaging its port bow and smokestack. The incident also placed the vessel's civilian scientists at risk.
We believe that it does not have any strategic gain on our part kung gagayahin natin sila. We just have to maintain our moral high ground, that we are law abider.
In response, China released videos and photos portraying the Philippines as an intruder, claiming their Coast Guard only acted to expel an obtrusive vessel from Chinese waters. CCG spokesperson Liu Tichen urged the Philippines to halt what they called violations, reasserting its right to protect its maritime claims. For its part, Akbayan Party List zeroed in on the ongoing standoff between Philippine and Chinese ships in the WPS. The group is pushing for the creation of a West Philippine Sea bloc in the upcoming 20th Congress to champion policies that safeguard the country's exclusive economic zone. They also want WPS lessons added to the basic education curriculum to combat online disinformation.
Ito yung mga kababayan natin at kasama natin sa Kongreso na naniniwala na dapat tayo ay nariyan, tayo ay nag-harness ng ating resources dyan at dapat naninindigan tayo laban doon sa encroachment ng China.
To make sense of the escalating tension in the West Philippine Sea, we're joined live by Ray Powell, Director of Sea Light Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. Good evening. Welcome to The Big Story.
It's great to be back. I like your new set.
Thank you. Well, Ray, the condemnable incident comes as you write in your recent article about how China has been really blocking access to Scarborough Shoal.
Yeah, we've really seen a lot of the action since last year move sort of north and west to Scarborough Shoal and also to Pag-asa. So the things seem to have settled down around Ayungin Shoal and Escoda Shoal, but now we see all of the action happening up there.
And how have these incidents escalated over the year?
Well, so specifically with Bao de Masinloc, we saw what we've seen, and we put in the article, a pattern of pushing out. So a lot more Chinese ships surrounding the shoal and pushing back any Philippine Coast Guard or BFAR ships away from the shoal. And I think that's very clearly demonstrated in some of the data visualization that we put out. And it's been acknowledged by the Philippine government. With Sandy Cay in particular, this seems to be an attempt by China to sort of, you know, if you look at what Pag-asa is a really unique place in the Spratly Archipelago. It's the only civilian population. And China has nearby, it has Subi Reef. It's got this huge military base that has no real legal status. It's a low tide elevation built up into a military base. And so if China were to be able to secure Sandy Cay, then it can say, well, this has a clear legal status because it's above high tide, or it's above water at high tide, which gives it would give it its own territorial sea. So there's this, you know, little legal maneuvering being played by China with regard to Sandy Cay as well.
Okay, so Sandy Cay has come to our attention in recent years. We never used to talk about that specific area. But this was also not the first aggressive incident. They did the chopper thing when the UP Marine biologists were there, and you know the sand was flying. This is around the time they found those piles of shells, right? Which they couldn't determine. whether they were just swept by the tide
Right.
or someone dumped them there.
Right.
Is that the reason why, or is it more that they want to take it over? Or do you think personally that those shells are to be used for some sort of island building?
Well, so right now, China has avoided inhabiting any previously uninhabited features. That's the one part of the 2002 Declaration of the Conduct of the Parties in the South China Sea that China has
That
really
they are
stood
honoring.
by. Yeah, right. They've sort of blown everything else up, but that particular thing, they've been very careful. So I'm not sure we're going to see China build anything there, at least not now. I think it's
But
possible.
they're setting the stage.
And it's possible that they are trying to basically reaffirm the fact that it is above water at high tide, which gives it, as I said, that more a legal
an
status of the
upgrade.
equivalent to Pagasa, so that they would essentially create a competitor for that territorial sea.
But it's so different. Pagasa's an island. It has, I mean,
So the way international law works is it really depends on whether you're above or below water at high tide. And the arbitral award found that there is nothing that qualifies as a full-blown island, in quotes, in the Spratly Archipelago because nothing can sustain life on its own. So in other words, even Pagasa needs support from the outside to sustain life. So that was what the arbitral award found. So in order to get the most you can get besides being an island, you have to be considered a rock. And under international law, Pagasa is a rock, and Sandike, if it's above water at high tide, would also be considered a rock and generate a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Subi Reef is considered a low tide elevation and gets no territorial sea under international law. So right now in that area, China does not occupy anything that gets a territorial sea.
Well, Ray, next week, President Marcos is heading to Malaysia for the ASEAN summit, and there he vows to advocate for a binding code of conduct in the South China Sea. But you did mention earlier you're a pessimist when it comes to a code of conduct.
I am.
Is it really all for naught?
Well, I mean, so we have this saying in the United States. You ever see the movie Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray wakes up and it's the same day every day? I feel like that with the code of conduct. You know, every year we get a new ASEAN chair, and every one of them is going to solve the code of conduct. I have said for years now that the basic problem with the code of conduct is the interests are just too divergent. What would be the difference in having a binding code of conduct? Somebody has to bind it. And who would the somebody be, right? Would China agree that would China agree that the somebody would be anybody that's not China, right? The answer is no, right? So China's claims have never changed. They claim everything within the 9-dash line. In fact, they call it indisputable sovereignty. And so the issue really is we're never going to see China agree to any binding in which China is not the binder.
okay. But doesn't mean we can't try. I mean,
I think we just have to keep our expectations in check. So I think when President Marcos talks about that, so I'm Ray Powell's opinion, I think he genuinely would like to see that happen. I think probably deep in his bones, he knows it's not going to happen, but that's what you have to say to generate good faith amongst your ASEAN colleagues and say, I'm committed to this process. But I think that if everyone was given truth serum, they would say, it's not going to happen.
so what best to do in this situation? It's frustrating.
Yep.
We are the weaker sovereign nation.
Yep. So I have categorized this sort of, I've tried to frame this as an occupation that the Philippines is under. It's a maritime occupation, right? So China has taken up positions in the West Philippine Sea that it essentially occupies. For example, that zone around Scarborough Shoal is
now practically controlled by them.
right.
Yeah.
So how does a smaller power, how does a resistance defeat an occupation? You outlast it. So, I mean, if you look at any resistance movement in history, it is a long-term proposition. So what does the Philippines do in the meantime? It builds national resilience, it builds international support, and it plans for the long term. So it is frustrating because it means that the Philippines is probably not going to be able to enjoy the great victories, like China's not going to suddenly up and leave Scarborough Shoal. So you have to think long term. Where do we want to be in 20, 25, 30 years? And how do we outlast this occupying force?
Right, because China plans ahead.
Yes.
And the Philippines sometimes doesn't do that.
You know, democracies are not really good at that. I come from a very large democracy. We are not great at it either. We tend to think in electoral cycles.
Exactly.
So.
Well, we thank you so much. We haven't even touched the giant clams.
Yeah, and the Scarborough
yeah.
Shoal.
Well,
So-
next time we're going to have to talk giant clams because that's a really interesting
Right,
topic.
It's
right.
super interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ray Powell, Director of Sea Light Gordionaut Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University.